the methodology section. Again, it has further sub divisions, and you have to explain each of these in detail. And I'm going to quickly go through them. First of all is the study design. We have discussed this in detail. At this stage, you have to simply mention the study design, whether you are planning a randomized control trial, you are planning a cross-sectional survey, is it a cohort or something else. You simply have to mention the study design, please. There's no need of any clarification, explanation, or justification for the study design in this section. Simply mention the study design and move on to the next section, which is, but please remember, it should be accurate and representative. And then you have to move on to the next section, which is settings. Settings means you have to explain in detail, state the place where the study will be conducted. So the place could be either a community-based survey or an intervention carried out in the community, or it could be a hospital-based study. So whatever the place, you have to describe it clearly. It could be an inpatient or outpatient, what we call an OPD research, or research done in the inpatient patients who are admitted in the hospital. It could be a single center or a multi-center study. So whatever is the case, you have to clearly mention the settings: community or hospital, inpatient, OPD, single center or multi-center. Then you have to mention the study duration, and you have to simply mention the month and year of start and finish of the study. So you might want to say that, like probably this study will be conducted from June 2020 to 31st December 2020, or probably from January 2021 to maybe July 2023. So simply mention the month and year of the start and finish of the study. This is very important. You have to define the study population, and you have to clearly explain the study population. And this is basically what we also call the place where you mention your inclusion and exclusion criteria. You include or you exclude patient on the basis of an age bracket. You might want to do a research in children, so you might want to describe that what kind of children less than 18 years of age, or less than 16 years of age, or less than 12 years of age you are going to recruit. You might want to enroll only males or females or all genders. Then you have to clearly define or describe what disease you are looking for and other parameters if they're applicable. So this is the place where you make your inclusion and exclusion criteria for including or excluding participants in your study. Sample size is absolutely important, and it specifically becomes very important wherever you are going to do a clinical trial. And you have to actually, you don't have to mention the detailed sample size calculations, but you have to mention that what software did you use and what confidence level did you use. These things are important. So you can say that, the sample size was calculated using WHO online sample size calculator, using a confidence level of 95% or whatever you feel is appropriate. And you have that in order to calculate the sample size, sometimes you have to do a literature search, and you have to give reference to the articles which was actually used for the calculations. So please, while doing literature search, also make a note of selecting the article that are ultimately going to help you do your sample size calculation. Sampling technique, we have discussed this in the lecture in detail, and then you have to mention the sampling technique. And but the most important thing is probably you have to explain in detail how the sample will be actually drawn, or how the sample would be actually taken from the population. And you need to understand it is going to be different if you're going to do a community survey. It's going to be different if you're doing research inside hospital. It's going to be different in case of an OPD, and it's going to be different in case of a inpatient department. Then you might be using a drug or a device or any intervention or instrument for your search. You have to explain all of these in detail as well. So for example, if you are using a drug, for example, I'll just give you a random example. Naproxen sodium versus diclofenac sodium in the management of acute low back pain in young males. So if you're going to use a drug, you have to describe all of the details of the drug in detail. For example, what preparation were you using? So it was a local preparation, it was a foreign preparation, it was a preparation by which company, local company, national company, multinational company. Then you have to clearly mention the dosage details. for example, 50 milligram, 100 milligram, 200 milligram, whatever it is, then you have to clearly explain the administration route, that whether this drug will be given orally, intravenously, subcutaneously, or intrathecally, or whatever it is, right? And then you have to clearly mention the frequency, whether the drug is to be going will be given daily, alternate day, weekly, 2 times a day, 3 times a day. So everything has to be mentioned in detail. Since you are physical therapy students, you might be using a lot of devices, physical therapy devices. So you need to actually mention the device in detail, whatever you plan to use in your own research. And that would include the name of the device, the model of the device, because we know that whenever the model changes, the output of the device can also change, and the function of the device can also change. So you have to actually mention the exact model of the device. Then you have to mention the year and country of manufacture, because you cannot compare an item made in Japan with an item made in, for example, Korea, with an item made in a device made in China versus a device made in Iran, or let's say in some other country. So you have to clearly mention that what kind of device you were using, and what was the make and type, and which country it originated from. And then you also have to mention the year of manufacture, because, for example, if you're doing research on physical therapy and you're using an old diatherapy machine of year 2005, so probably that machine has not been calibrated, it's out of date, and it will not give the output as good as a machine of year 2018. So you need to mention all these things in detail. If you are doing any intervention, and again, in physical therapy you do a lot of interventions. So for example, if you are trying to do uh, PNF versus Kelton mobilization in management of adhesive capsulitis, right? So you have to mention everything in detail, and if possible, you have to use pictures, and you have to explain every step of the procedure. For example, if you are using technique A, you might want to reference the article that used that technique A for the first time. You might want to actually explain all the steps of that particular technique. And you also might want to explain that why you are preferring this particular technique over some other particular technique. Instruments mean basically survey instruments or questionnaire that have already been validated or used in other research studies. And it could be a standardized survey, or it could be a questionnaire. I just told you earlier that instead of like designing your own questionnaire, although there's nothing wrong in designing your own questionnaire and then validating it, but it might take you a lot of time. So if you're short of time and you already know that there's a validated questionnaire available that has already been used many times all around the globe and also is available in your own local language, so it might be a good idea to use that particular instrument or that particular survey. It is not only going to save you time, but it's also going to facilitate your data collection process. So if you're going to use any instrument, whether if you make it yourself, you have to explain it in detail. And if you're using a standardized questionnaire or a survey, you have to reference it and then explain in detail how did you acquire that particular survey and how do you plan to use it. Then coming to the study procedure, you have to explain your plans for recruitment in detail, including how are you going to allocate a patient to different arms if it is a randomized controlled trial. And if it is an RCT, you also have to explain the randomization process, the blinding procedure in detail. So again, recruiting patient from community is going to be different from recruiting patient from an hospital. Patient recruitment from an outpatient is going to be different from the patient admitted inside the ward. And sometimes even, recruiting patient from the emergency department is going to be totally different than recruiting patient from a stable OPD. So all these things have to mention in detail. Then again, if your study involves repeated visits, either by the researcher or by the patient, you have to exactly quantify and describe the number and estimated length and number of each study visits. So for example, you are going to do a physical therapy techniques and you're going to provide that technique 3 times a week for the next 4 weeks. So you have to actually describe in detail that I plan to provide this particular physical therapy technique 3 times per week on alternate day, maybe Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. In the morning, it is going to be a 45-minute session, and this session is going to last for 4 weeks. So you have to explain each one of them in detail. Then if you're going to perform any particular procedure or any particular intervention, then again, you have to explain that too in detail. So for example, if you are going to provide mobilization or you're going to do a manual, a myofascial release on alternate visits. So you have to explain that in detail, that how you're going to actually do that particular procedure. And in this, actually a chart or a pictorial might be helpful to explain what you plan to do. Compensation is an important issue in enrollment of the patient, although we don't give it much importance in developing countries. But in the developed world or in places where research culture is well established, it's a very important thing that has to be understood, and it has to be clearly mentioned in your research protocol. So compensation, again, it could be both monetary compensation and non-monetary compensation. And please remember, there's absolutely nothing wrong in offering your patient a monetary compensation for the time they are spending and for their willingness to attend your clinics or their willingness to attend a research that's going to benefit the humanity at large. So, but again, you need to understand that the compensation, specifically if it is a monetary compensation, should be justified, and it should not be too much of a compensation that is going to lure the patient toward your research. So, for example, you might, in context of Pakistan, so giving the patient, like a coupon for lunch at the end of the session, or offering them that their travel cost from their home to the hospital will be reimbursed, is totally adequate or a legal monetary compensation. You can always offer them non-monetary compensation. For example, if someone is doing a research on, let's say, osteoporosis. So now there are certain tests like DEXA scan that are done for the evaluation of osteoporosis. So the researcher might offer that, if you enroll in this research on drug management of osteoporosis, we are going to get your DEXA scan free of cost. So that is a non-monetary compensation and stuff like that. So it's very important that you, whatever compensation you're planning or no compensation, you have to clearly mention it in your research protocol. Then if it is, again, we just discussed all this thing in detail, that if it is a drug study, you have to mention the instruction for administering the drug to the person who is going to administer those particular drugs. Then handling instruction, because we know that certain kind of drugs, they have to be maintained in a cold chain. And if they are taken out of the cold chain, or if they are put in a hot environment where there's a lot of moisture, the drug loses its efficacy. And then you have to mention clearly how the drug will be stored, and once the drug has expired, or it is not more in use, how it will be disposed of. If you're using a survey, a cross-sectional survey, again, you have to mention clearly who created the survey and whether the survey has been standardized or the validity study has been carried out. If it requires translation into local languages, whether it was done or why it was not done, and and how the survey will be distributed and how it will be returned, whether it will be a pen and paper survey or whether it will be an online survey which people are going to do in their own time, and they're going to email you back the result of the survey, and how the confidentiality will be maintained in case of a survey. So you have to mention all these things in the study procedure depending on the type of research that you are planning. We don't deal with biological sample, but again, if research is dealing with biological sample, it has to explain clearly in the research protocol how the sample will be collected and how the storage will be done, how the sample will be tested, and ultimately, once the samples are done with, how they will be disposed of, whether they will be cremated in an incinerator or they will be disposed of in a particular place. You have to clearly mention all these things, specifically in case of a biological sample. And if you're going to do a behavioral study in case of psychology or psychiatry, then again, you need to identify the instrument or the questionnaire being used and who will be administering these questionnaires or instruments, including their qualification. And this is actually very important in the case of physical therapy as well. So whenever you are trying to explain that that I'm going to do this intervention in my patient, you have to clearly explain the professional experience of that therapist as well. Because for example, for any technique, you can't compare, and you can't. It's not possible to say that intervention, physical therapy intervention given by a youngster with less than 1 year experience is equivalent to a physical therapy intervention being provided with an expert who has got more than 15 years of work experience. So these all things do matter, and they create hidden biases, and you have to clearly explain them while doing your own research as well. Apart from that, then comes the next step, which is the data collection procedure. And in this, you have to mention the detailed step of the data collection procedure. include that how many visits and data collection points are planned. So in case of follow-up studies, sometimes you do a data collection at point zero, that is before doing an intervention. Then you probably might want to collect the data at every intervention, or you might want to collect the outcome data at let's say 2 weeks or 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Then they are mostly the studies which we conduct mostly in our setup are short-term follow-up studies, that the follow-up ranges only from 4 weeks to 12 weeks, that is 1 to 3 months. But then there are really good studies which have a long-term follow-up, which actually might go up to 1 year and beyond that. So whatever you are planning, whether it is a short-term study, it's a long-term study, it's a study that's going to continue, and you generate different data points, like the famous Framingham study, which is around 70 years old, and it has been generated like thousands of articles, and the data collection points have been described that they collect data after every couple of years, and then they describe. So whatever you have described, whatever you want to plan, whether it is a short-term or long-term study, you have to explain your data collection points in detail right in your research protocol. And this is very important, how and by whom the selected participant will be approached. So whether you're doing a questionnaire-based study, or you're doing like intervention study or a clinical trial, it's absolutely important, specifically when it comes to blinding, that you know the person who is doing the intervention should not be the person who is going to collect the data. So you need to understand all these things, and you have to mention it clearly in your research protocol. And again, I mean, most of the time we don't actually explain all these things to our patient, but it's very, very important that whenever you are about to take an informed consent from a prospective study participants, you have to clearly explain the study objective to the patient, and you have to make sure that the patient understands the potential benefit, discomfort, side effects, or the adverse effect of enrolling in that particular research. It's very, very important, and you have to explain that how you're going to ensure that. So probably your research questionnaire might be in English, but you are going to explain that in that thing to the patient in a local language. It might be Urdu in our case, right? Then very, very important, how the informed consent will be obtained. Whether you're going to go for a verbal informed consent or a written informed consent. It's advisable that you go for the written informed consent, because it will give you a permanent record of the consent that has been provided by the patient. In case of minor participant, there is a concept of assent, and you should actually like understand that as well, because as physical therapists, you might be giving certain intervention to children, like minors less than 18 years of age, because WHO definition of pediatric patient is actually till 18 years of age. So WHO considers persons less than 18 years of age as pediatric population. But again, if someone is a teenager, someone is from 12 to 18 years of age, so he or she, if he or she actually does not agree to a particular intervention or a particular procedure, a physical therapy technique, you have to ask for his or her assent. So consent in case of minor will be known as assent, and they have all the legal right to say no to an intervention, even if their parents say that they should be undergoing this particular physical therapy technique. So you need to understand this concept of assent, informed consent, verbal and written both. Then again, it's important that you clearly describe how you're going to obtain data. So there was a time that the only option we had was that we had to approach the patient via paper and pen. But now we are lucky that we have at our disposal this power of internet, and you can actually have an electronic tablet in your hand in which you can collect data right then and there, or you can send a survey questionnaire to your colleagues or to the prospective respondent via email, and without like leaving your home, you can have access to a lot of data. But this all has to be explained clearly in the research protocol.